Welcome to the Regeneration International podcast.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Alexis Baden-Mayer. I'm the political director of the Organic Consumers Association. This conversation today is part of Regeneration International's World Food Day broadcast, and it is under the banner of the new MDs, the moms, the doctors, and the scientists who have put their brains together to figure out what's making our children sick. What's Making Our Children Sick happens to be the title of a book by Dr. Michelle Perro. We also have Dr. Stephanie Seneff with us. She's the author of Toxic Overload. And we have Zen Honeycutt from Moms Across America, and she's the author of Unstoppable. And honestly, I just can't believe that I'm with you three right now. You three are my top heroines. And I remember the moment that I became aware of each of you. Actually, Zen, I don't remember the exact moment because I think I came to understand what an unstoppable force you are over time working together as activists. But I remember seeing Dr. Michelle Perro in Jeffrey Smith's films. And right before this conversation today, I just went back and rewatched Secret Ingredients. And for anybody who's watching, who wants to, we're gonna get into some stuff today in this next hour, but there is so much more. And so if this is all new to you, you need to go back and watch the films Secret Ingredients and Genetic Roulette and get in touch with Institute for Responsible Technology and Jeffrey Smith's work, because that's how I became aware of you, Dr. Perro. And then I think it was Zen. I think you were the person who showed me Dr. Seneff's work. Dr. Seneff, you published a series of just mind-blowing articles explaining exactly how glyphosate, the pesticide that we're exposed to more than any other, how that causes all of these diseases that are now so common, whether we're talking about allergies or eczema or anything related to gut dysbiosis, if we're talking about kids' behavioral issues or learning disabilities, and those are the basics, the baseline that most people are dealing with today. You managed to explain how the body's systems, how this toxin comes into our body and then results in those various problems. And I only scratched the surface. So I don't even know where to start, but we also have breaking news here because Zen Honeycutt has done a brand new study getting into what's in school food. And that just blows the lid off of all of this because, we think of this as a private problem, something, as individuals, we deal with our health, we talk to our doctors, we examine the science. But this is a societal problem. And I'm so happy, Zen, that you took this on to look at what kids are eating, millions, hundreds of millions of kids eating every day. And so why don't we start there? So Zen, why don't you introduce us to your study, and then we'll get Dr. Perro and Dr. Seneff to weigh in with their expertise.
Thank you so much, Alexis. And I'm so glad to be here with Dr. Perro and Dr. Seneff as well to hear their perspective on what all this information means. We decided to test school lunches because obviously there's so many children that are impacted by it. There's 30 million GMO meals that are served each day to our children in schools, breakfast and lunch. And for many children, that is the only food that they will eat. The poverty levels in America are astounding. So we felt that this was incredibly important because we know that 1 out of 6 children now has a learning disability. 1 out of 5 Americans have mental illness. 54% of the children are chronically ill. So, something is impacting them, and we believe it's the toxins in the food supply. And what better than to look at the school lunches than to figure out what's going on here. But we knew we shouldn't just test for glyphosate because so many farmers are moving away from glyphosate now because they're learning about the harms of glyphosate, which I'm sure Dr. Perro and Dr. Seneff will talk about. So we thought we really should test for all of the most egregious pesticides that are in the food supply, as well as what glyphosate and AMPA. AMPA is the breakdown of glyphosate. So we had the lab test for 220 different of the different pesticides, the most egregious ones. And I have to point out that we made sure that they tested for the ones that were most widely used. And I have to say that because the FDA, the USDA and the California Department of Food and Agriculture, they will put out data saying, 98% of the 1,200 samples that we tested for this year for pesticides were not above the detectable level, right, of pesticides. But when you go and look at what are they actually testing for, and you look at you compare that list of, say, 200 pesticides, and then you look at the list of the most widely used pesticides, out of that top 25 of the most widely used pesticides, you will only find 3 of them on the list that the USDA and that the California Department of Food and Agriculture test for. And I know this because I was on the organic advisory committee in California, and I compared those 2 lists. And when I brought this to their attention, in the meeting, I was not a very popular person because they didn't want that news to be, out there. So we tested for the most widely used pesticides. Okay. So glyphosate, 220 of the most widely used pesticides. And then 108 different veterinary drugs and hormones. And we also tested for the 4 top heavy metals, most widely found heavy metals, ones that were already found in baby food. And then we also tested for a dozen or so nutrients, because we suspected that the nutrients would be sorely deficient. So that was the goal of the testing, to get a very broad view of what's going on. Of course, we could have tested for phthalates and PFAS and BP, like all different kinds of things, but that's what the lab was able to test for at that time. So should I get into the results? I guess. Yeah. So the results were 95.3% of the school lunches were positive for glyphosate and AMPA, and not at low levels. Some of them at very high levels, like 258 parts per billion, and anything above 25, according to the lab and previous studies by Michael Antonou of the UK. Anything above 25 could be directly correlated to liver disease, according to the rat study that showed that 4 parts per billion per kilogram per body weight contributed to liver disease. So in humans, about 25 parts per billion would contribute to liver disease. So I'm sure Dr. Pero has a lot to say about liver disease. And then the results with the pesticides was 74% of the samples contained at least one of 29 different harmful pesticides. And these are pesticides that cause tumors and cancer and endocrine disruption, embryonic toxicity, all kinds of things. In addition, we found 4 veterinary drugs that they were found in 9 school lunch samples, and some of them at levels up to 130 parts per billion. And that's not a low number. The lab technician was shocked to have found that much. He's never found that much in any other samples before. And then 100% of the school lunches were positive for heavy metals. And these levels were also not low. They look low if you look at that. Some of them were 2 or 17 or 29, all the way up to 94. I'm guessing that a layman would be concerned about that. But when you compare those numbers to what the EPA allows in water, it's shocking, because what the EPA allows in water is like 0.015 of lead, 0.005 of these other heavy metals, 0.5, very low levels. So when you do the math, 94.4 parts per billion of lead found in a bread product, I believe it was a pretzel, is 6,293 times higher than what the EPA allows in water. I mean, it just doesn't make sense that this would be allowed in our children's food supply. So the heavy metal levels were shocking. And I'm sure, Dr. Pero will talk about what that means in our children. Heavy metals are extremely concerning. And then, of course, with the nutrients, as you would suspect, they were very low in nutrients. In fact, one of the advisors gave back his analysis that at least 50% of them, the majority of them had 50% or less, some of them almost none of the, close to none of the minerals that were being needed for the recommended daily intake, right? Like, I don't want to say none, but very, very low levels, which would be needed for the recommended daily intake. If this school lunch was, say, 1 out of 4 meals, a snack and 3 other meals that were consumed, they would be getting definitely less than 50% of what they're supposed to be getting for their recommended daily intake. So our kids are besides being poisoned, they're being completely devoid. Their meals are devoid of nutrition, which which is essential for thinking and for behavior and development. So the results were horrifying, to be honest, and far worse than we thought. Because when you look at even just the glyphosate, 95.3%, when you look at the detox project testing that was recently done, about 60% of the samples tested in the grocery store were positive for glyphosate. So 95.3% is way higher than what the average American is eating, in grocery store food. And it's extremely disturbing that we'd be treating our children this way.
So, Dr. Pero, Dr. Seneff, who wants to go first reacting to this news? It's not good news, but are you surprised?
I'll chime in from the health perspective, and then Stephanie, you can give us some of your amazing insights. And thank you, Zen, for this project. And the most shocking thing is that the moms have to take this on. Of all the shockers, and the whole study is shocking, not surprising, but yet shocking, is why our government's not doing this. But that is indeed another conversation. All of this is horrible news, but I want to look at that nutrient density in those heavy metals, because that was surprising to me. I knew our food was contaminated. To find 100% contaminated with heavy metals is serious business. And you have to appreciate there's two factors. That one, American children over the past 2.5 decades since we've introduced GMOs and their associated pesticides have developed intestinal issues. American children now have leaky gut, where their guts are like porous and foods are passing with other toxic chemicals and metals into their bloodstream. So that's a problem. Constipation, kids are refluxing, their tummies are bloated. And don't forget, there's this thing called the gut-brain axis, where the gut chats with the brain. If the gut's bad, the brain is bad. There's this relationship, and it's actually the gut-brain microbiome, those bugs in the gut. When kids are nutrient deficient, which if this is all they're eating, they're going to clearly be nutrient deficient, as well as the normal metals. The heavy metals get taken up more. So these kids take up more heavy metals. So they're passing into their bloodstream. And because they're so nutrient poor, they're even getting a bigger dose of these heavy metals that are really hard to get out. What's the problem with these heavy metals? So glad you asked. Well, the biggest problem is neurocognitive dysfunction, meaning learning. What are we seeing an explosion of? ADHD, like the literature says 10%. Oh, it's way higher than that, because a lot of kids are not officially diagnosed. Autism, since I wrote that book, it was 1 in 58. It's now 1 in 30. Every type of neurologic processing disorder, from kids who can't read, who can't hear, who can't have abnormal sensations, picky eaters, hypersensitive children, that alone, and all the behavioral disorders that stem from that: school, home, sleep, and eating. So we have this, we can focus on, like, I just read a study about aluminum and asthma, aluminum causing asthma in a recent paper. So these metals are not benign. Neurocognitively, autoimmunity, respiratory atopic diseases, which are allergic disorders. So this is profound. A number of pesticides, profound. No studies looking at, when the kids get all these together, the toxic effects. So we think Roundup is bad, glyphosate-based herbicides. Some of those fungicides in there are just as bad, if not worse. And then all the adjunct chemicals, like the butoxides, and I hope Stephanie can go into that, the piperonal butoxide and other chemicals, they're all bad. None of those should be there. None of this should be in our kids' food. So health issues, profound. Who's monitoring it? Other than moms, bravo, Zen and moms. But now we, the new MDs, are going to pick up on this, and we're going to change the conversation. And I'll hand it over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Michelle. That was very, very informative. I can go on and on about glyphosate. That's the subject I know the best. In my book, Toxic Legacy, it explains exactly how glyphosate disrupts so many things in metabolism, and certainly messing up the minerals, both causing the minerals to be deficient and actually causing the minerals to be distributed incorrectly, such as they become simultaneously deficient and toxic. And I wrote an article about manganese, for example, and manganese deficiency systemically, but manganese toxicity in the brain, in the center of the brain, because the manganese is being distributed in a very odd way, because glyphosate chelates the manganese, makes it unavailable to the gut microbes, messes up the body's natural mechanisms of distributing it, and ends up with it concentrated in the wrong place. And I think the same thing is happening with aluminum. So it's ironic that you have both deficiencies in these critical minerals that are nutritionally important and biologically active, that they catalyze many enzymes, the manganese, the magnesium, the zinc, the cobalt, the copper. And I believe those were the ones that Zen pointed out as being extremely deficient in the food supply, which is not at all surprising because those are the same ones that glyphosate, Don Huber showed tremendous reductions in the uptake of those minerals into the plants as a consequence of glyphosate exposure. And another one was sulfur that he showed was dramatically reduced. And of course, Zen didn't test for sulfur. Sulfur doesn't have a minimum daily requirement. The government thinks there's no problem with sulfur. I believe we have a crisis in sulfur deficiency in this country, and that a large part of that is due to glyphosate not only making sulfur unavailable to the plants that we eat, but also completely disrupting our metabolic processes by which we handle sulfur in the gut and systemically in the body. That's a lot of what I wrote about in my book, the issues with sulfur. And the autistic kids have a very clear sulfur issue, and in particular, a sulfate deficiency problem in the brain that I wrote about before I even knew about glyphosate. I had a paper that I worked on with a student of mine. In 2012, we published a paper showing all these different ways in which it looked like sulfate mismanagement was connected to autism. And in my book, I talk about many different ways in which glyphosate disrupts the sulfate system. So all of that is very, very interesting to me. And it's amazing how clearly it all fits together. That's what I was really struck with glyphosate. And, Zen mentioned fatty liver disease. That is a tremendous epidemic in our country right now. And I think Zen said in her article, 1 out of 3 people in this country suffer from fatty liver disease. And there was a study that I wrote about in my book where they looked at people who had fatty liver disease versus those who didn't. And that's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD. And the ones who had more severe cases versus less severe cases, 3 different groups. And they showed statistically significant differences in the levels of glyphosate in the urine among those 3 populations. Very, very striking to say that correlation between the fatty liver disease and the amount of glyphosate that showed up in the urine in the test that they took. That's really remarkable to me. And of course, studies have been done on both mice and rats to show that minute amounts of glyphosate exposure over a period of time causes fatty liver disease in these rodent models. So that's really, really striking to me. And so you've got the liver damage, the liver disease, you've got issues with bile acids, you've got issues with fat digestion, you've got issues with protein digestion. You end up with too much nitrogen in the colon that causes pH problem. I mean, it's just an incredibly complicated and shocking amount of disruption that happens when you are chronically exposed to glyphosate. And the thing about glyphosate is that it is insidiously, cumulatively toxic, and it's a slow kill. And the regulators have not seen that. They have been able to be blind to the fact that glyphosate is causing tremendous disruption of our metabolism over a long period of time. So it's really the accumulated experience you've had with, now glyphosate was introduced into the population in 1975. That is a very long time. It's now 2nd, 3rd generation showing up. And it's showing up in our children with all this toxicity that they and their parents, and even sometimes their grandparents, have been exposed to. That's causing these tremendous problems that we're seeing with our children. All these diseases, obesity, diabetes, as I said, liver disease, kidney disease, Alzheimer's, autism. There's a huge list of diseases, pancreatic cancer, that are going up exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. And people say correlation doesn't mean causation. But I say, if you see that kind of correlation that's so striking, you better find out what is the causative mechanism by which this chemical could cause that disease. And that's what I talk about in my book. I can give specific instances with each of those diseases, why glyphosate would be predicted to cause that disease, given its insidious cumulative toxic effect, which is to substitute for glycine by mistake in proteins during protein synthesis. And it's quite an interesting story. And you can find the specific proteins that have what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif that's going to make them especially sensitive to glyphosate substituting for critical glycine residues, messing up that protein, causing that disease. And I can do that for all these diseases that are going up.
Wow. So much to unpack there. Stephanie, I could go for about 6 hours unpacking that, but I just want to hone in on one of those pieces you said on how it affects the health of children. And there was so much we can look at, but I want to look at the liver. Let's just go back to that liver issue because it's bigger than we think. Zen mentioned 1 in 3 adults have this fatty liver. It's called non-alcoholic, since it used to be that alcohol was the most common cause of fatty liver, but now it's called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It was 1 in 4 just a few years ago. Now it's 1 in 3. Well, what about kids? Well, for kids, non-alcoholic fatty liver is about 13% of them. In obese children, which is now affecting 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 children, depending where they live, economic status, ethnicity, etc., it's about 1/3 of them have fatty liver. And in one study out of Italy, I saw a significant number of the obese children with the fatty liver went on to NASH. NASH is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. It is the sequelae of fatty liver, which goes on to fibrose, meaning harden, eventually leading to something really bad called cirrhosis, where the liver fails. What's so important about the liver? Everything. It's your major organ of detoxification. It cleans up a whole bunch of stuff. It produces vitamins. It helps with cholesterol synthesis. It stores carbohydrates. There is so much that your liver does. These issues, both the fatty liver and the more serious sequelae, it's called NASH, NAFLD-NASH, is that they're silent. And the only way you can pick them up is on an ultrasound. I can tell you, practitioners who care for children are not thinking this way and not screening people. And as an aside, I can tell you that they're not doing that. As an aside, when Stephanie mentioned the lack of enzyme production by the pancreas and your kids can't break down fats, adults can't break down fats, when I screen these kids, they have fatty poops. And when I look at their digestive enzymes, they're so low. And then when I change their diet, I need to support them with some digestive enzymes and rebalance the microbiome and give them bile acids. I mean, this is complicated. It comes back up. I'm working with someone right now. Half her food is filled with glyphosate. It gave her NAFLD, and now she needs digestive enzymes until we rebuild it back. This is outside the purview of traditional conventional medicine, and our practitioners are not equipped to deal with the problems that we are artificially creating, unnecessarily creating.
Well said.
Wow.
Very significant. Yes.
Well, I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but I do have I do receive hundreds, if not thousands, of stories, anecdotal stories from moms, and I also read a lot of science. And one of the stories I want to tell 2 stories in relation to this, and and get Dr. Michelle and Dr. Stenoff's reaction to it. To them. One of them is about the hamsters. There was a study I saw in Smithsonian Magazine, and there were hamsters in Germany. And the farmer noticed that the hamster population in his monocrop cornfield, we know what that means, most likely GMOs with glyphosate, were rapidly declining. And he was, I guess, a very considerate farmer because he was concerned about his hamsters, and contacted a local university and asked them to come out to study what was going on and why was this population of hamsters in his cornfield declining. So they reproduced the whole study. They got the hamsters, they got the dirt, they got the corn, they got everything that was being used in that field. They reproduced it in the lab. And what they noticed was that the female hamsters were cannibalistic. They were eating their own young on the first day of life.
Wow.
And when they studied the hamsters, they noticed that they were completely devoid of one vitamin B3, and the precursor, tryptophan. But that was the only vitamin. And so when they administered vitamin B3, the cannibalism completely stopped.
That's amazing.
Yep.
So wouldn't you, as a doctor and a scientist, and Alexis as a mom, wouldn't we wonder, like, wait a second, what if there's just some vitamins missing in our kids who have violent and aggressive behavior, and adults for that matter? Shouldn't we be looking at what their vitamin levels are? And wouldn't you suspect that this monocrop culture, farming with all these chemicals and fertilizers would be contributing to that deficiency? I don't know the science behind that. Do you, Dr. Stenoff? How could maybe perhaps corn be completely devoid of vitamin B3? What would be, is it the body of the hamster? Like, what is going on there that would make that happen?
Right.
And do you think it's happening in children?
I think that's very, very interesting. And of course, I have looked hard at tryptophan and its products. And in fact, tryptophan is a precursor to niacin, which is vitamin B3, but it's also a precursor to serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter in the brain that's associated with sort of love and feeling and good feelings. And in fact, when you have serotonin deficiency, things like obesity is connected to serotonin deficiency, violent behavior, depression, they're all connected to serotonin deficiency. So you have this tryptophan, which is produced as a product of the shikimate pathway, which glyphosate famously disrupts. So it's disrupting the shikimate pathway in the foods that the kids are eating and also in their gut microbes. And so they have a deficiency in tryptophan, which leads to a deficiency in both serotonin and niacin. And niacin is so critical for metabolism. So then they have their metabolism is defective. They can't make enough ATP. I mean, there's a huge number of consequences to having insufficient niacin. It's absolutely critical in the mitochondria. And then if you're drawing it towards the mitochondria, you're missing out on the serotonin. The brain doesn't have enough serotonin. Serotonin is also sulfated in transit, and it's delivered to the brain in a sulfated form. That sulfation pathway is also disrupted by glyphosate. So glyphosate disrupts both the synthesis and the transport of serotonin, which results in a serotonin deficiency in the brain, which then actually induces excess dopamine production, which is associated with autism and also with ADHD. So there's a huge cascade of issues that come about, starting with glyphosate disrupting that critical shikimate pathway that produces the tryptophan.
And and I might add as well regarding this very same pathway is when we disrupt the microbiome, because glyphosate is also an antibiotic, and then you have an overproduction of Clostridia, and what is common in kids on the spectrum is too much Clostridia type of species, and because now you become dysbiotic, where your microbes are out of balance. Not all Clostridia is bad, but when it becomes a pathogen, because you lack the balance of microbes, those Clostridia produce certain chemicals, P-cresol and others, which then also change the brain chemistry. And you have too much dopamine and excitatory chemicals in the brain, which then causes these kids to be out of control, ADHD-like symptoms. So again, it's another mechanism on how these pathways are affected via glyphosate. So very interesting. One more aside about that niacin. I read a paper recently how they're using niacin in treating people with COVID and long COVID.
I saw that too.
And they're finding that it's very successful. I'm thinking, well, these people who have long COVID, are they just filled with glyphosate, and what are they eating? And
exactly.
they all deficient. So the people on COVID, the shooters, all the violence out there, how much glyphosate's in their urine? Because according to the CDC, 80% of us have glyphosate in the urine. And if you're a kid on a school lunch, it's probably all of them.
Right.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be laughing.
Dr. Pero, have you seen children with aggressive behavior be deficient in vitamin B3 or any type of vitamin? Is that at all connected?
I've seen a global in kids on the spectrum when we test their nutrients, for those we can get a hold of, they're globally depleted. They're low in all the vitamins, the B12, the B3, the B6, zinc, magnesium. They're just globally deficient because they're malabsorbing, because they have intestinal permeability. Their microbiome is deficient. They have really lack of heterogeneity of their microbes because of many factors. So one of the tools we use to get these kids on back is heal their leaky gut, rebalance the microbiome, and restore nutrients.
So it's not just that the food is just completely deficient of vitamins because of the agrochemicals in the food supply. It's also because when the vitamins get into the gut is permeable, and so the vitamins go out. So they're not absorbing it for two reasons, is what you're saying.
Right, they're malabsorbing, and if they're taking any fat-soluble vitamins like vitamins A, D, E, and K, those are fat-soluble vitamins, and they can't break them down because their pancreases aren't working very well. They're just probably malabsorbing those things. They're going right out. You have to be able to absorb the nutrients that we're consuming, and that's what this whole system is, from the mouth to the end. The bottom, the tush, is all about extraction of nutrients as it passes along out the other end. And we have many systems in place along the whole route to help us. And our biggest friends that help us along are the microbes. And we're literally killing off the microbes. So we're binding up the nutrients. We're killing off the microbiome. It's a perfect poisoning system.
Yeah, and cobalamin is another B vitamin that's really problematic and deficient to many people. And that one, it's very difficult to get that properly absorbed. And many people can't absorb cobalamin. Even they take high doses, it just goes straight through. And that's because of the complicated, way in which cobalamin is absorbed doesn't work well in the context of glyphosate. Glyphosate messes up the absorption of cobalamin. So you can't get enough even if you're taking it orally.
And that's the B12. And that's why so many kids, for example, on the spectrum wind up doing a lot better when they get their injections of B12. And it has to be in a certain format that they can inject it. It has to be methylated because many of these kids have genetic SNPs, genetic alterations. They're called single nucleopeptides. And they have additional burdens where they just can't metabolize these nutrients. So what we have to get back to, and which is what we talk about with Regeneration International and all our organizations, is regenerating the soil, because the plants are deficient. So even if you are eating organic, which these kids in our schools clearly are not, organic food may not have chemical inputs, but they may be nutrient poor. So without that enriched soil, regenerative soil, we need to rebuild. And that's via the microbiome, soil microbiome, human microbiome.
Yeah, it's the same thing. To feed the soil, the same things you need to feed the humans to heal them, right? You have to heal the soil first, and then you get the healthier food, which can then work to help the gut. So it all goes back to the soil. I've really become aware of the importance of nutritious soil.
I want to add on to the anecdotal part of the story that I mentioned earlier. Speaking of feeding and restoring the gut. So this was several years ago that I got this story, but from a mom who lived in Santa Ana, low income neighborhood. She called me because her best friend was Spanish speaking, and so she called to relay the story to me. And the Spanish speaking mom, single mom of 4 kids, low income, had a child who, when he was 9 years old, he had mental health issues, and she told the school, and they didn't do anything about it. And then one day they called her and said, "You need to pull your son out of school. He just threatened to blow the school up with a bomb and kill everybody in it." And she said, "Well, I told you that he has mental health issues and I need help." So they sent him to I never know, is it a psychologist or a psychiatrist? The one that can administer drugs.
Psychiatrist.
A psychiatrist, thank you. So they sent him to a psychiatrist with the mom, and the psychiatrist said, "Okay, here's your prescription," after, reviewing the child. And the mother said, "Well, that's it? What about like what's causing this and with the side effects, and like he's just going to take this drug for the rest of his life?" And he said, "Well, have you considered what's in the food? What are you feeding him?" And she said, "I don't like, chips and burritos and hot dogs and pizza, like whatever I can get into him, like he's a very picky eater, like whatever he'll eat." And so he said, "Well, you can either consider the toxins, like the food dyes and the chemicals and all of that's in the food, or you can give him this prescription. Like you can either go organic or give him this prescription." And so she went organic. She found a way to buy rice and beans on a very limited budget. And within 2 weeks, one of the teachers at the school called her and said, "We don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it, because this is a completely new child." Wow. And at the time of the call, she said he is now, I don't remember what it was, 16 or 17 years old, but he's of the age where he's just about could go out and get a gun and shoot up the school. And she called me because it was like a week after a recent shooting. I'm not sure which one. There's been so many of them. And she said, "I just want you to know that I'm clear that my son will not get a gun and shoot kids at his school because we went organic and we took the toxins out of a diet. But if I had not done that, and organizations like yours were not sharing about, GMOs and toxins, and all these other groups were not sharing about it, I think he would have done that. And hundreds of kids' lives would have been affected. Thousands of people would have been affected. And so she just really wanted me to know that her son was healthy now and responsible. And he was even helping to start school gardens at his school. Yeah, he works on community gardens. They grow food for the schools. I mean, it's just like such a heartwarming story, And so when I talk about eating organic and looking at the toxins in the food supply, I really mean it when I say that this can alter lives forever. This kid has a new future because his mom's found out about the food, what's going on in the food supply, and everybody at his school has a new future because of that, right? Like
That's so great.
Had a very different future. So, I mean, as a doctor or a scientist, what else can we do to get the parents and maybe other doctors or somebody, the government, to support testing for nutrients and raising awareness about this issue? I mean, we're what else can we do here?
I can chime in with one local anecdote here, and then we can hear from you, Stephanie. Locally, there was a group here that started organic foods in our local schools in my county, and they had this one school that wasn't performing well. They put an organic garden in. They had chefs, local chefs, come in and cook with the kids. The kids were chef ambassadors. They had a beautiful garden there, and the program was a smashing success. They UCSF came in to study the program, and within 1 month of instituting this new garden and a change in the food, attendance went up, improved attendance rates, a decrease in absenteeism, behavior, and visits to the principal's office went down. This was a primary school. This group took this program to a lower income area, even more lower income, and where the kids were eating 2 to 3 meals a day at school. And again, 1 month in, great success. Kids are loving these lunches. Who stopped it in that school? The union. The school, the food union felt threatened by loss of jobs, and they stopped the program, even though the workers in the kitchen of this food union, their own children were in the program.
Wow.
So we have a political piece to work out as well. But no doubt, these conversations, we hope, inspire parents to get involved at the local community level, because that's where it all begins. Community level gardens in their own schools, and say, here, look at Zen's study. Here are these folks, a doctor, a scientist reporting on it. What are we doing at our school? And what can we do? Because I did a comparison lecture on school lunches from around the world, and we were lower than countries like Brazil, Ukraine, Greece, Turkey, and the best lunches were from France, where kids were arguing about whether they liked the manchego or the brie. I can't make this up. They had a cheese course. In France, they had cooked food at tables, and when they were given American school lunches to sample, they all went, ew. It was, and I saw a video of it. It's real. So we can do better. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to add anything in there as well.
Well, first of all, I think that's so fantastic. And it seems so great to integrate education about how to grow food by having the kids actually participate in growing food at the school, growing organic food and then eating it. I can't think of anything better to teach the children, to make them understand the importance of healthy food, and then to benefit from it because they are able to eat the food that's the product of their own efforts. I think it's an extremely good lesson for the children. It should be part of the public school program across the board, I would say. And I want to get back to the serotonin issue with the violent behavior, because I have suspected for quite some time now that glyphosate is a major player in the epidemic we're seeing in the school shootouts. And in fact, many people have pointed out that many of those kids who go berserk and go and kill people they don't know are on SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That is a very popular drug to treat very, emotional problems and psychological problems. It's a very popular drug and drug class, this SSRIs. And what they do is they prevent the serotonin from going back after it's released into the synapse so that it lasts longer. And that's a way to kind of get around the serotonin deficiency problem. But the problem is, of course, that eventually becomes a serotonin deficiency on steroids. It makes the serotonin deficiency problem worse, especially if you're not getting the drug. So your body becomes very reliant on that drug to keep forcing the serotonin to stay in the synapse. So the underlying problem is a serotonin deficiency problem. And if you fix that problem, you fix the violent behavior, and you fix that problem by going on an organic diet. So all of that makes a lot of sense to me.
And those microbes produce serotonin, and 80% of the serotonin is produced in your gut.
I know, that's right. And it's sulfated before it's shipped to the brain. And the sulfation problem is also wrecked by glyphosate.
So, you have this deficiency, but you also have a deficiency of gut microbes. You're not producing enough serotonin. There's a whole field of therapy now called psychobiotics, where they're making probiotics specifically to deal with this, to produce the serotonin and improve mood. But I'm thinking yeah, that's great. But what about we get to the root cause on why the microbes aren't making serotonin? Is that we're killing them off with what's in the food, glyphosate,
exactly.
Herbicides. And I have to point out, this is a sidebar and we can talk about and get into it. And I know this paper that came out in 2019, Stephanie, which showed how glyphosate causes autism in rats, or maybe they were mice actually. I forgot which kind of rodent, using this soluble epoxide hydrolase enzyme pathway. The mechanism was laid out. And what the paper suggested is like, oh, we'll just inhibit this pathway in a drug. And then we can prevent the way a glyphosate is causing, not correlating with autism. It's like, wait a minute. Can we just remove the glyphosate, the root cause medicine? This is not rocket science, folks. It's take away the poison.
But then they wouldn't make money on the drug, on the
I know.
it's
actually coming and going. I think that the agrochemical industry and the pharmaceutical industry are the same thing. It's the same companies. Like Bayer is the one that offers the glyphosate now. And I think they understand that as long as they continue to poison the population, they're going to make plenty of money off their drugs. Some of the companies offer a poison that causes a problem, that they have a drug that fixes that problem. They offer both, so they've got you coming and going.
Yeah, a good example of that is AstraZeneca and Syngenta, right? Syngenta makes the largest number of pesticides in the world, and their sister company is AstraZeneca. And AstraZeneca has at least 400 different medications that treat the very symptoms that their pesticides cause. And when I went to Syngenta and sat down with the research and development women on their team and talked to them about this, they looked aghast. Like they looked like they didn't get that was what was actually happening. And I was like, no, I don't know if it was an act or not, but they looked like, oh, but we don't do that. I'm like, but yes, you do. Look at all of these medications that you have that treat the very same symptoms as the pesticides. And they looked very uncomfortable with that. They did stop. They said they lowered the amount of glyphosate that they were selling the next year. I don't know if it was correlated or not, but I am glad, Alexis, that you're hosting women to talk about this, because I feel like our voices have just been so, muted about this. I mean, I have to mention Barbara Stitt. She's a Lifetime Achieving Award winner that wrote a book called Food and Behavior, The Natural Connection. She did a 20-year study on parolees, and it was one of the first books that I read about food and behavior. And she studied, like, for instance, dropouts in a college with 5,000 students. There were 500 kids that were dropping out in high school. And after they got Whole Foods, took out the soda and the chips and all that stuff, and Whole Foods. And this was in the late 90s. So I don't think she knew that she was taking out GMOs and chemicals so much, but it was Whole Foods that they put in and took out all the sodas and junk. That number dropped to 14, from 500 to 14. And the same thing with the parolees. Usually it's about 70% recidivism rate. They go back to prison. Well, that reversed. 70% stayed out of prison, and only 30% really came back when they had Whole Foods in the prison. And when she talked to the serial killers and the parolees, the criminals, and found out what they had in common, it wasn't their socioeconomic background like a lot of people would imagine. It wasn't that they were from low income. It was that they bragged that they lived on junk food. They were like, oh, all I eat is Coke and Hot Pockets, or, although I don't want to get something from Hot Pockets, but just an example, like they bragged that they lived on, pizza and chips and soda and junk food. And that was the thing that they had in common. So she knew, this was decades ago, that the deficiency of the vitamins impacted their brain and how the decision-making that they did and their quality of life and their success in life. So I have to say, I'm kind of frustrated that people aren't listening, that this is what's happening, and think that I'm insensitive because I'm mentioning the food. Like, what are these shooters eating? What are these serial killers eating? And they think, oh, Zen, you can't just chalk this up to food. Well,
right.
maybe we can.
Yeah, maybe we can, right? Yeah, and it's good that you brought up the whole issue of these, what I call pseudo foods, because, one of the things, you get all kinds of complicated molecules from plant-based foods. And all these plants produce all these exotic molecules that are, like quercetin, all these different that are often herbs, herbs and spices. These things have really interesting molecules in them that support our health in ways that we don't understand. And we think of vitamins, we got the B vitamins, the C vitamins, we know all those vitamins, but there's much, much more than vitamins in those whole foods. And when you basically process them into starches and sugars and fats, and protein, and you mix them up and make a soy protein bar, that is not at all the same thing. You have lost a lot of the nutritional value that is not measured in vitamins and minerals. It's more than that.
it's this tags on to two political things that are happening, and one of them is this plant-based drive right now from foods like Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger, Crickets. I don't know, whatever the drive is. These industrial food-like products that they're either full of the GMO, like the Beyond, like the Impossible Burger, or they're just full of legumes that are filled with pesticides, like, pea, soy proteins, et cetera, et cetera. The legumes are really high in glyphosate because they are filled with chemicals, mostly glyphosate-based herbicides, because they're used as a crop desiccant at the end of the crop growth, and then they dry out the crops with Roundup and other glyphosate-based herbicides. So we're pushing, especially kids, millennials, young people who want to eat more plant-based diets, on these plant-based pseudo foods, and those are not real foods. And I'd say stay away from those. So that's one problem. The other problem is medical education, and that the medical education is devoid of anything that's nutritional or non-pharmaceutical. And if it's non-pharmaceutical, then it's not real science. So we have to debunk this myth that nutritional medicine is not real medicine. And that stems from Rockefeller. And boy, we can go back 110 years to look at where that came from. But that is the present model in our medical system. And so when those of us talk about nutrition-based medicine, it's not real medicine. And we talk about this stuff, we're not being science-based. I said, really? Zen and Stephanie are not being science-based? I don't think so. Have you tried to read Stephanie's work? Let me know how. So these are the political and academic challenges that we have to break down these barriers. And the way that we like to go around it, I think we can all agree here, is to the moms and dads, to the parents, on how we create a ground up, roots up, grassroots level movement. And that's what we're trying to do, is get right to the people who are eating.
Absolutely. I've long since really almost given up on the government. And it's sad to say that, because I used to be proud to be an American, and it's been a long time since I was proud to be an American. I have to confess, I'm just so upset with our government for their willing blindness to this problem when they see the autism rates going up every year. And it's not something they even talk about. They're just denying that there's a problem. And meanwhile, they're poisoning the population, and somehow they think that's fine. And I don't understand that. I find it criminal.
I have to add that when I was releasing this information, I confessed to a friend that I said, it's not just that this food is so poisoned that bothers me, that disturbs me, like to my core, that like if I think about it, I'm just going to weep for days. It's that the majority of the politicians that learn this information are going to ignore it. Mm-hmm. And that's that right. Is a betrayal at the deepest level. That disturbs what, I know men are concerned about safety too, but women are incredibly concerned with safety, right? Like if we don't feel safe, we have a hard time functioning in our relationships. We have a hard time trusting. We have a hard time being peaceful and happy. And, when mama ain't happy, nobody's happy, right? So when you've got a lot of unsafe women walking around because their government isn't doing their damn job, you've got a lot of unhappy people and a lot of unhappy families and husbands and kids because mom's not happy. So, it's really very disturbing that our politicians and our elected officials aren't doing anything about this. And, recently glyphosate was ordered, the Supreme Court ordered the EPA to come to a decision by October 1st. Hello, it's October 6th. Have they come to a decision? No, they said we need another 4 years. They're ignoring a Supreme Court order. So, they're pulling shenanigans like this. Meanwhile, moms across America, we had like 10,000 moms call the EPA when we found glyphosate in breast milk, right? Like we met with the EPA for like 4 times. We've had congressional hearings in the government. And Alexis, all about working in DC with the government on this. But and we did have actually one EPA staffer that said to us, we encourage you to communicate the moms with us by any means necessary. Somebody in there did want us to, hammer them with emails and calls and communications. And there were some people in there that wanted us to communicate with them. That person in particular was switched from the department. After that, is in a different department now. And the other one that I had any kind of conversations with as well is in a different department now. But, I do believe there are good people in the government, and we still do need to hammer them with this information, but we can't wait for them.
Right.
We have to keep on it, and we have to keep raising awareness about this because they're just taking too damn long.
Yeah, and we can do the problem. We can solve the problem by ourselves. And I think with people refusing to buy the food, the toxic food, and insisting on organic, certified organic, and that's pressuring the farmers too, because then the farmers say they won't buy our food, so we better grow something else. I think it can really work down to pressuring the farmers to change their ways. For Americans to produce more organic, we have to import a lot of our organic food because there's so much more demand than there is supply. And I want to give a shout out for Mexico, because Mexico has decided they're going to ban glyphosate, period, I think starting in 2024. And our government is pressuring them left and right to try to get them to back down on that. This is what makes me very sad about American politicians, is that we seem to be not only ignoring the problem, but working in the opposite direction to try to prevent other countries from doing what they want to do to help solve their own food crisis.
Yeah, for Mexico, it's 2023, and they receive a significant amount of imports from U.S. to Mexico of GMO corn. And Vilsack, the revolving door Vilsack, who's met with Mexico to pressure them to change their policy about not accepting our product anymore. Corn is king in Mexico, and Zen and I did a recent whole day with International Day of Corn celebration last week. So this is big. Now, this EPA thing, can you imagine if they were in our businesses and they said, yeah, we can get that report out to you in 4 years? They'd be fired.
Mm-hmm.
I said, fire them. That is incompetence. It's gross incompetence. A report, I think, should have it done in a week.
They have enough science, Stephanie? How many studies do you think are there about glyphosate right now showing harm to animals and humans?
And they're coming out left and right, by the way. And in fact, really interesting new studies are showing transgenerational effects, that when the grandmother is exposed to glyphosate at small amounts while the mother is in utero, then the child has effects that show up from that exposure way back then. Transgenerational effects through epigenetic mechanisms.
And when we brought that study to the EPA with Dr. Zach Bush, probably 2 years ago, we were told that legally they cannot consider transgenerational, like multi-generational studies. They can only consider that impact of that one generation. Yeah, it's ridiculous. But I have to ask, is it, just for the viewers, is it a couple dozen studies about glyphosate? Is it a couple hundred? Or do you think that it's reached 1,000 studies now about glyphosate showing harm?
Yeah,
what do you think?
I imagine there are 1,000 studies out there. Some of them may not be. I think it's really the more recent ones. And I think there's been a change since 2012. And I want to give Seralini credit for that. Professor Seralini in France, when he did that long-term study on the rats, where he exposed them to low-dose glyphosate for their entire life, and also the GMOs, and he found harm, but he didn't see any damage after 3 months. And of course, the industry said you only have to look for 3 months in animal studies. If you don't see anything after 3 months, you're good to go. That's how they could get out of, seeing the toxicity that glyphosate causes. It's a slow kill. And Seralini found by the end of the experiment, they died young. They had reproductive issues, both the males and females. The males had obvious damage to the liver and the kidneys. The females had massive mammary tumors. All kinds of things happened over the course of the lifetime of these rats. And that was an epiphany, I think, for a lot of the researchers, because I think many people people who are in the toxicology business, they're like, well, I'm not going to study glyphosate. Glyphosate's safe. Why would I waste my money studying something that I'm just going to get a negative result? Mm-hmm. But once he showed that low-dose glyphosate is not safe, then you started seeing all these low-dose experiments showing that it's not safe, like the liver study that I mentioned earlier. Lots of things are coming out. And then the ones that are looking at the subtlety of exposing the mother to glyphosate exactly in that period, they know when the fetus is very, very sensitive to toxic exposures, and to do it exactly there, and then to look and see what happens to future generations. Those kinds of studies have only come out in the last few years, and they're finding obvious effects. And so as they look, they find, and once they find, more people look. And I think that's what's happening right now. There was a study on the female babies that came out recently that was looking at this measure, which is an anogenital distance. It's a metric for exposure to testosterone in utero. And they found this compared to the level of glyphosate in the urine of the mother while she was pregnant. Very straightforward study, statistically significant result. This problem that you see with the child is an indicator of polycystic ovary syndrome. which is an epidemic right now. Many women are suffer from that, and it is the primary cause for infertility in women. And so I think that's a direct connection between glyphosate and infertility. And it's also connected to autism. People who have polycystic ovary syndrome have an increased risk to autism, and their offspring have an increased risk to autism.
You know, we can add in there too, Stephanie, that when Dr. Seralini did those studies, he also found that there were high levels of heavy metals in the glyphosate-based herbicides, and Roundup, which is the glyphosate and the surfactants and all the proprietary secrets, were more toxic than just glyphosate alone, because these chemicals are formulations of many toxic substances, and their surfactants break down cell membranes, so the glyphosate is yet more toxic. So what they've done is they've rolled out 20 years of harm, and now we've had to spend years of our lives showing the harm and proving the harm, which is what happened to the precautionary principle. So they've hidden half the stuff proprietary, and now we've had to rediscover it and what they put in there and the harm it's done. And these untimed studies, in the Impossible Burger study, they only studied those rats for 1 month. And like a few of them died. So this Seralini, thank you, because he studied the rats for 2 years, and they only studied juvenile rats. We're eating GMOs based on a 3-month study of juvenile rats. That's it. And there are only 3 studies on health on just GMOs, not GMOs and associated pesticide. 3 human studies, as far as I know. Stephanie, you might know one more. And they and that is shocking that we're eating this for 25 years and no human studies except 3.
And the EPA knows this, and they will admit it. When I was in a meeting with the EPA towards the end of the meeting, I said, "Do you have any long-term animal studies with blood analysis on Roundup?" And they said, "Which one? There's hundreds of different, formulations." I said, "Any of them?" They said no. Then I said, "Then how can you say that it's safe? How can you allow it on our food?" And they ended the meeting. So, people assume that this product that's sitting on the shelf, that they're spraying in their backyard and they're letting their kids run around barefoot over it, which just happened to one of my friends. Her son got cancer. Her father died. He was spraying Roundup on the back patio. They were part of the Monsanto lawsuit. The son lived, but the father did not. They assume it's safe because it's on the shelf. They assume that the government is doing their job. When a mother sends her child to school to eat a school lunch, she assumes that school lunch is going to be safe because the government is supposed to be doing their job. And they're not doing their job, and we are outraged about it. We have plenty of science. Michelle, you're saying that we have to rediscover. The problem is the EPA knows this. There's documents from the Monsanto trials, from people doing countless FOIAs, Freedom of Information Acts, and finding out what they're actually looking at. They know this, and they're looking the other way. So it's we really have to take matters into our own hands here, and that's what the school lunch testing was all about, and that's what all the research that in the books that you both have written is all about, and what Organic Consumers Association and Regeneration International is all about is bringing the truth. So I really appreciate being able to speak about this.
And I am so grateful that you did this, because it's long overdue. And I hope you shame the government into doing more, and then to recognizing that they need to change their policy with regard to school lunch. It's such a great opportunity for the government to offer healthy food to the students, to the population, the children of our country. There's no better way to give them good nutrition than to feed them a healthy lunch at school, and they're not doing it.
And please,
they should be shamed into doing it.
And please don't consider ketchup and apple juice. They are in 2 fruit groups on school lunches: apples and ketchup. I read it myself. This is true.
I have to mention the apples had some of the highest levels of pesticides.
Right.
The fruit and the study.
And it's apple juice, which is a sugar water, and ketchup, more sugar with a little bit of tomato. So we have to say enough. Enough is enough. And maybe this would be a good time for Alexis. You want to maybe put the drawstring on this conversation and kind of wrap it up, because I think we've hopefully made the point to the listeners. Thank you, Regeneration International. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Zen, and Alexis, of course. Thank you. So maybe this would be a good moment.
Yeah, well, there's a lot more to be done, and I hope that everyone will follow Moms Across America.
Well, it's cutting out for a little bit for me, but you said something about next steps. I would just suggest that people go to momsacrossamerica.org, and also Children's Health Defense. They did fund half of the testing. So we really appreciate Children's Health Defense and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the entire staff there. So go to momsacrossamerica.org or Children's Health Defense. I believe it's .org, and get the information. We do have a letter that we would ask for you to send to your senators and the representatives and the USDA. We would think it would be a badge of honor, like a really good thing for a senator or representative to, push a bill through to have safer, healthier, non-toxic, nutrient-dense lunches. That would be a no-brainer. So, but they need to hear from thousands of us. So please go into our blog and to, Moms Across America and click on that to sign a letter. Thank you.
Thank you, Zen. And I'll take over from Alexis. Her internet must have went poof. Stephanie, how can people learn more about what you're doing and give any links to the listeners?
I have my webpage, stephanieseneff.net, and my book is Toxic Legacy. I actually have it here, Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. And this is soon going to be available in paperback, so I'm excited about that.
It's a great book. And Michelle, what about your websites?
So you can come visit us at drmichellepero.com. I have lots of information on the parent ed section. We just launched Regeneration Health International. Stephanie is one of our fabulous advisors. I'm going to loop Zen in very shortly. Zen doesn't even know it yet. You guys are going to hear how we're going to get Zen in the mix. So we're working on food as medicine, of course, and solution-based. Enough belly aching, we're going to fix it. And GMOScience.org, my baby, been at it a long time. And the next book will be out 2023. Say a prayer for me, making our children well.
Awesome.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, I'm going to just say thank you, everyone. Thank you, Zen, Stephanie, Alexis. Thank you. Thank you, Regeneration International. Thank you, Global Food Day. And we really enjoyed being with all of you here today. And we're going to say ciao, and we'll be back.